Hello everyone, my name is Vincent Wayman, and this is a presentation that showcases my findings for this particular case study, which happens to be my capstone project of choice for Google's data analytics certification program. For anyone unfamiliar with this case study, I suggest going over my full analysis in the link below before viewing the rest of this presentation. If you don't have time, I'll give a quick upfront overview. Cyclistic is a fictional bike sharing company, and the marketing analytics team, that would be me, has been tasked with finding evidence with a data probe that either supports or opposes the idea that the company can convert a significant portion of its existing customer base to buy into an annual subscription service. So before I get into this case study, I'd just like to quickly introduce myself. My name is Vincent Weinman. I'm a recent BCom graduate in MIS with a minor in computer science. I'm aspiring to become a data analyst, and at the time of recording, I am looking for any opportunities that will help me put my foot in the door in that field. So feel free to get in touch with me if you want to network or if you think I'd be a good fit on your team. So before I give a summary of my findings, I'd like to revisit the purpose of this project's data probe. What started this project was the idea that Cyclistic could convert a sizable chunk of casuals into members and reap the benefits with higher lucrative profit margins. Before any kind of conversion strategy can kick off, it requires executive approval, and to inform that decision, I've taken a data-driven approach to weigh the evidence and discover any relevant opportunities or hindrances to the project. So the data probe was framed around the question of asking myself how members and casuals use Cyclistic differently. This difference gives us an idea of how challenging it will be to bridge the gap to convert casuals into members, and how this difference can be leveraged to make conversion possible. Based on the limited granularity of our data, we can say with some level of speculation that casuals primarily use Cyclistic for leisure, whereas members tend to use these bikes to commute. So I want to emphasize that this is only a theory. I wasn't able to conclude that this is actually the case. To test that theory, we would need to collect more data that breaks our data down in a way that we can clearly identify the differences between your typical casual and your typical member. The main problem with our data in its current state is it's too general, and there's no way to tell if there are any outliers that introduce significant bias. However, to give some weight to our hypothesis, we'll go over a few key findings. To start with an important metric, your typical trip's average ride length. This line graph shows that on average, casuals take 3 times longer on their trips than members year-round. The same holds true when you zoom in on a particular week, or day, or even hour. So why is that? If you were thinking to yourself, well, casuals probably ride their bikes further, you'd be kind of wrong. This is a bar chart that displays the difference in distance between stations for your typical trip in casuals and members. You'll notice that their distributions are roughly equivalent, with casuals maybe riding a little bit further based on the difference in error bars. So what does that tell us? Well, we can assume that casuals are probably trying to make the most out of their time with their single-use passes, and we don't know what they're doing that takes them so long to get from one station to the next. But we can probably assume that they're not immediately going from point A to point B. To explore further, let's move on to the geographical density of these bike trips. Maybe that'll give us a better idea of what they're up to. This is a map of Chicago, and it represents the geographical density per user group in the last year or so for bike trips. Right away, you'll notice this tendency for casuals to congregate along Chicago's coastline. If we zoomed in, you'll find that the coast is full of beaches, parks, and trails, among other kinds of leisurely attractions. On the other hand, members tend to be a lot more spread out inland, and those areas are full of commercial skyrises and residential buildings. This tells us that members are probably relying on Cyclistic to commute during their daily routines. On this slide, we've got two pie charts of each user group's proportion of bike trips on weekdays versus weekends in the last year. Saturdays and Sundays seem to be a very popular time for casuals to ride, which can be attributed to the fact that most people have weekends off, which is the usual time of the week that people typically use for leisure. On the other hand, members don't seem to favor any day in particular, with every day of the week having roughly the same proportion of trips. As much as this supports our theory, we do have to be careful not to mislead here. These charts are based on the entire population of observed bike rides in the last year. It doesn't break down the story for your typical casual or member. That is to say that there could be a decent number of hardcore members that bike every single day, multiple times a day, effectively skewing this pie chart to show that members don't prefer weekends when that isn't the case. This is a line chart that represents the summed number of bike rides per user group at any given hour on a weekday. You'll notice that the number of rides for members peaks around the time that most people commute to and from work. This trend is also followed by casuals, but to a lesser extent. Although it looks like there's a significant correlation between rush hours and member bike trips, we again can't jump to conclusions. Like before, we're only looking at each group's bike trip as a whole. There could be severe outliers skewing these numbers whenever a member wants to grab a bite to eat. Who knows? For your final piece of evidence, there is the disparity in the number of rides per season. These pie charts represent the bike trip proportion on a seasonal basis for each group. Right off the bat, you'll notice that summer is a clear favorite for casual riders with a negligible blip during winter. Members follow the same trend but have a recognizable devotion to biking year-round to make the most out of their annual subscription. If we zoom in and compare the two, you'll recognize a sizable difference in the number of bike rides per user group in winter in particular, with members dominating 4-1. But that only accounts for about 6% of our total observations, with a clear preference among both sides to ride in the warmer seasons. So our findings supports the theory that casuals use these bikes for leisure and members use them to commute, and we didn't find anything to support the contrary. But we can't say with certainty that this is the case without getting a closer look at your typical user on both sides. Our data is only good enough to make some generalizations about each group, but that's not conclusive. We have no idea what each user group's distribution looks like, and we don't know anything about the average user's demographics or values. We're too zoomed out to treat our conclusions as anything but conjecture. We firmly believe that approving any kind of conversion strategy at this stage is really risky because it largely relies on these generalizations that I've made. Let's look at your options moving forward. If Cyclistic can afford to be precautionary by committing additional time and resources into reiterating the data analysis process, you can go with A and take what we've learned to test our initial findings and potentially expose opportunities that would facilitate conversion or reveal more lucrative options. Obviously, this is the safe choice, but it does include more time and resources. If that's not possible, we can still try to apply our initial findings and go with B to kickstart a few strategies while applying due diligence to minimize the risks involved. If you went with option A, the analytics team would have to re-evaluate its approach, and that begins by redefining the problem by framing it in a way that determines the root cause of the different behaviors we are interested in. We know how these user groups are different in some capacity, but we haven't arrived to the why behind these distinctions. If we want to be able to market to these people, we need to know what makes them tick and what we can leverage to persuade them to increase their commitment to Cyclistic. We would then move on to a broader data collection phase that captures important data reflecting how users are motivated, what their quality of life looks like, and what their typical cyclistic routine consists of. This data is essential to bring more granularity into the analysis. We want to be able to break things down to your typical user and determine what strongly correlates with their cyclistic purchase decisions. For instance, let's assume Bob is one of our active casual users and is representative of your average casual user. We find out that he's earning minimum wage, so he can only afford to purchase single-use passes on the weekends to have fun biking with his buddies. That's important information because if a sizable portion of casuals, like Bob, are below the poverty line, it doesn't matter how good Cyclistic's conversion strategy is if these users cannot even afford to make the switch. Finally, we would conduct a thorough analysis that would paint a more complete picture with concrete connections explaining the key distinctions between user groups. This analysis would also prove useful in order to expose any hindrances or opportunities ahead that would facilitate or impede any kind of conversion strategy. If instead you decide to go with option B, we would recommend beginning by not limiting yourself to a conversion strategy and examine the viability of expanding the current services and price points offered. This strategy seeks to remedy any serious flaws with the current cyclistic experience, preventing casuals from wanting to commit more than they already do. It also considers the economic view of a casual's reservation price and whether there's any way that we can optimize it to introduce more profits. For example, if your typical casual only uses cyclistic bikes on the weekend, consider the cost versus benefits of introducing a reasonably priced yearly weekend pass. This kind of offering entices casuals that can't economically justify a yearly pass that they'll never make the most out of, and strays them away from having to repeatedly purchase single-use passes that are frustratingly limiting considering how often they use the service. Obviously, Cyclistic has the potential to lose revenue here if these new customer types can make the most out of this. However, considering the low amount of bike trips per winter, we imagine that won't be the case. If executed correctly, this new price-optimized offering could become the most lucrative price point for Cyclistic. A second strategy consists of focusing the marketing efforts towards conveying information that would incentivize a significant increase in bike usage among casuals, which would naturally persuade them to become more active and make the transition to become members. However, we do need to be mindful that an increase in bike usage comes with an increase in cost for Cyclistic too. Cyclistic would need to carefully analyze the impact of this strategy and ensure that it's sustainable without introducing any major pain points into the cyclistic experience, like severe bike shortages. So what would that look like, and what's needed to increase the odds of success? Well, we would need to target what matters most to these casual audience, like wealth, health, carbon footprint, whatever the case. The impact of increasing bike use has to be conveyed in a way that is honest and effective. Lastly, we could provide more incentives to being a member by introducing a higher level of service to annual subscribers. Much like how first-class commercial flight passengers enjoy more comforts than economy-level passengers, the annual cyclistic subscription should come with more of a benefit beyond unlimited bike trips. So those benefits should look at relieving any existing pain points in the cyclistic experience, such as coming up to a station and missing out on your favorite bike type, or even worse, coming up to a docking station without any bikes at all. Let's use this as an example. Let's imagine Bob, the casual user, comes up to the docking station and takes the last electrical bike and is gone on his merry way. Joe, on the other hand, a member, depends on Cyclistic to commute. He walks to the nearest docking station to pick up a bike and go to work like usual, except he only uses e-bikes because, I don't know, maybe that's the only bike that works for him. As Joe, you've been inconvenienced, and that experience will irk you for a couple hours, especially if you notice a casual running off with the last available bike of your choosing. Now, imagine what would happen if Joe could reserve a specific bike ahead of time. Any kind of risk of inconvenience is removed from the experience entirely because he can check it out. He starts his day off feeling good. Bob, on the other hand, comes along, sees that it's checked out, and is a little upset because he can't come up. He came up to the docking station with the intention to get the last e-bike. And what can he do? Well, at this point, he can either go on his merry way with a different bike type or choose to upgrade his service level to acquire the same level of benefits and convenience afforded to members. Now, would this kind of shift be enough to convince casuals to convert in droves? Probably not, if those pain points do not have enough of an impact to incentivize a user to pay a lot more for the same biking frequency, but with additional privileges. However, it's worth examining how painful those pain points have the potential to be among casuals and what the threshold is before they find an alternative product or they decide to pay up to remove those pain points entirely. To summarize, we've recommended two possible paths moving forward. You can either reiterate the data analysis process and dig deeper into why members and casuals behave the way they do to gather the required insights to inform a precise data-driven decision to move forward with. Or you can forge ahead with one eye closed and recognize the potential risks of a premature marketing plan. We fervently advise against choosing the riskier path because of how little we've learned and how substantial the unknown could be to the point of hindering the effectiveness of a conversion strategy. Whatever path you choose to go down, a mass conversion of a significant portion of your customer base requires extreme care. Furthermore, it's important to have tempered expectations regarding the success of an undertaking of this size. Change does not come easily for most. Without the introduction of significant innovation, we can expect the majority of casuals to avoid being converted. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you for your time and your attention. If you want to leave some feedback, you can go ahead below. Thank you.